Our Lieutenant Governor was born and raised right here on the south side of Chicago, continues to live on the south side of Chicago, and we are just so fortunate to have her as a champion of this work. So with that, please welcome and thank our Lieutenant Governor, Juliana Stratton.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you, Chancellor Salgado, for that warm introduction. We are so honored to be here at Kennedy King College, an institution that has paved the way for so many in our communities. And as always, I am so grateful for your leadership, Governor Pritzker. I'm honored to serve as your partner in leading this great state of Illinois, and I thank you for your unwavering commitment to justice, equity, and opportunity. I would like to give our governor a hand. I want to make special mention of our director of the Justice, Equity, and Opportunity Initiative, Quinn Rollins, if you could raise your hand. And his fantastic team, Emily Harwell and Ariana Correa, as well as the entire teams from my office and the Office of the Governor who have made this day possible. Thank you. Thank you to all of the community organizations, advocacy groups, law enforcement, victims' rights or advocates, agency directors, legislators, and other elected officials and leaders from across the state who are members of what I like to refer to as the Justice League, who recognize the value of our justice work. And if you would allow me a moment, I don't want to give each name because I know I'll miss people, but if you are an elected official, may you please stand so you can be recognized. Thank you for joining us this morning. Thank you for being here and your commitment to justice. And then before I begin my comments, a few more people that I want to acknowledge. First, I just want to thank my husband, Brian Eccles, for being here, who is the biggest justice warrior that I know, and I'm so glad he's here for this important day. And I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the hundreds of men and women that I've spoken with over the past year, who, of course, could not be with us today because they are behind bars. I thank them for bravely adding their voices to this work, and I'm grateful for Caleb, the poet, for sharing that beautiful piece that helps acknowledge the humanity of all. Almost a year ago today, we gathered for our inauguration. Many of you were there, and some of you will remember that I passionately spoke about my family, specifically about how my family's journey is grounded in the story of my great-great-grandfather, William Stevens, and his twin, Daniel. Both had been enslaved and settled into a small community known as Stevensville, Mississippi, which carries their namesake. I shared that 2 summers ago, I had the honor of visiting this community and listening to their stories, as had been passed down through the generations. Stories of how they supported each other and built a beloved community. I learned that they built a school to provide quality education, a church to foster benevolence and grace, and a marketplace to develop entrepreneurship and economic growth. As enslaved people, my ancestors had endured one of the world's greatest injustices, but they were striving to write another narrative, one of justice, equity, and opportunity. My journey to Stevensville centered me in our mission for governing the state of Illinois. Nearly a year to the date that Governor Pritzker and I raised our hands and took the oath of office, 360 days to be exact. These stories continue to center me. And I am proud that we have traveled across this state and listened to people who are striving to write their own narratives right here in Illinois. From Winnebago to Cairo, and from Stateville to State Street. Our Justice, Equity, and Opportunity Initiative team has met with hundreds of different stakeholders who believe in the change we've accomplished and the change that is yet to come. And they've shared their stories with the governor, with me, and our teams, very personal stories that until now have often fallen on deaf ears and have festered for far too long. These stories sit with us as we take action. A few months ago, during one of our visits to a county jail, our JEO team sat in circle with about 15 men to hear their own journeys and respective circumstances that ultimately led to incarceration. Many of their stories were all too common, growing up in economically depressed communities, suffering from trauma, substance use, and mental health conditions, and the barriers that they faced in their daily lives due to racism and other forms of discrimination, the majority of them being men of color, reflecting the disproportionality we see at every single level of this system. Many of them were accused of low-level crimes, petty thefts, and low-level drug offenses, but had lingered in jail many months, and in some cases, for more than a year. And most had yet to be even found guilty of any crime. When I asked them, what prevents you from being released while you are awaiting trial? And the answers were both simple and similar. All except for one person replied, "Lieutenant Governor, it's because we cannot afford bail." And so we began a long and heartfelt conversation with these men about the gross inequities in our criminal justice system. You see, for many families, $1,000 or even $100 in bond might as well equal $1 million. Each night, hundreds of thousands of people in our country, often mothers and fathers separated from their children, are sleeping in cold, windowless jail cells simply because they cannot afford bail. Jail can be a life-altering experience, not just for the men and women who are incarcerated, but think about their children who are left home to their own devices. How do they fare? In the words of James Baldwin, the great writer from the civil rights era, how extremely expensive it is to be poor. And far too many have not only been affected by our jails, but our prisons. As many of you know, I've been visiting prisons throughout Illinois. Last May, our Justice, Equity, and Opportunity Initiative went to support a first-of-its-kind graduation ceremony at Stateville Correctional Center, where 7 men earned their bachelor's degrees from Northeastern Illinois University in fields ranging from American jurisprudence to criminal justice policy. I was joined by Dr. Angela Davis and Chance the Rapper, and staff from our Illinois Department of Corrections, as well as the families and peers of these men who were so very proud of their accomplishments. These men shared their stories, and I was so personally moved that I wanted to get to know them better. And so I went a second time. And this time we met with men who were studying to get their master's degrees. And we sat in circle with them to hear their stories. And one of them told me, "Lieutenant Governor, I was born in 1978. When I was 21 years old, I made a very, very stupid mistake for which I'm guilty and which I accept." And he told me that although he was sentenced to 55 years in prison, he had been diligently working to change his life. While in prison, he had gone to barber school, he had mentored his peers, and he had been getting his education, and he was now on course to earning his master's degree in Arts of Christian Ministry and Restorative Arts in May of 2022. But because he was sentenced in the year 2000, he may never see the light of day. You see, for many incarcerated men and women, they receive little to no credit, no good time served, even when they have been rehabilitated. He was sentenced in Illinois after our state dramatically changed its sentencing laws. had he been sentenced just a few years before, he would likely be getting out soon with his master's degree in hand. But because of our punitive, outdated sentencing laws, he will not get out until he's 77 years old in the year 2055. This is why we are here, to write a new narrative, and this is why I stand with our governor, who ran on a campaign to bring big change to Illinois and who spends every waking moment contemplating how to make life better for the people we serve. As many of you know, Governor Pritzker signed the executive order establishing the Justice, Equity, and Opportunity Initiative in February of last year. And we knew from the very beginning that justice reform can never be limited to simply talking about policing jails and prisons. Justice reform is about striving to make equity and economic opportunity a reality for every community and every Illinoisan, because we simply cannot have justice without equity and opportunity. For me, that means that we address education, and our JEO team has already begun collaborating with the Erickson Institute, one of our country's foremost child development research institutions, to develop policies that address how childhood trauma influences life outcomes. We started working with the Illinois State Treasurer, Michael Frericks, to develop a college savings account for the children of formerly incarcerated parents. And we've worked with Representative Delia Ramirez and other legislators to launch the Children of Incarcerated Parents Task Force to develop innovative legislative policy solutions. Why? Because real justice must include equitable access to educational opportunity. Our JEO team has been working on health care. More than half of the people in Illinois prisons are diagnosed with mental health conditions, and it is our responsibility to ensure that they have health care. And so now we are enrolling people in health care upon re-entry, starting with our youth. And this was simply not happening when we took office. And guess what? This past October, more than 90% of the youth who were released from the Illinois Department of Juvenile Justice had health insurance within 1 month of their release. 90%. This would not be possible without the leadership of Director Heidi Mueller, who leads our Illinois Department of Juvenile Justice. She understands, like all of us in this room, that real justice must include access to health care. And our JEO team has been working on housing. This summer, we collaborated with the Illinois Housing Development Authority and housing providers to improve where the state has historically failed, supporting the housing needs of men and women who are leaving our prisons. And so we launched a housing initiative to help support rent for people returning from our prisons, because we know that without a place to sleep, it's incredibly difficult to focus on other areas. Our team is also working with the Department of Corrections, the Department of Human Services, and other community stakeholders to go beyond supportive housing. And we're strategically thinking about what it means to expand shelters, increase access to affordable housing, and reduce, if not eliminate, some of the legal barriers that lead to housing instability. Real justice must include access to housing. And our JEO team has been working on economic development. As I'm sure you all know, we have legalized adult use cannabis in Illinois this year. And we're proud to say that we've designed one of the most equity-centric adult use cannabis laws in the country. And this is because the war on cannabis is a stark example of the inequities that as black and brown people have historically been more likely to get arrested for possession of cannabis despite roughly equal usage as whites. So, as a form of restorative justice, our commitment to social equity includes reinvesting dollars into communities through our Restore, Reinvest, and Renew program, which we call R3. The R3 program drives 25% of cannabis tax revenue to fund programs and strategies that reinvest in communities across our state that have suffered from historic disinvestment. These are the communities that have been most harmed by the war on drugs and tough on crime policies and broken windows policing and countless failed criminal justice policies which instead of leading to justice have instead led to mass incarceration. And in the coming days, we will be announcing the designated communities for these funds. And I want to say thank you again to Governor Pritzker and the members of the Illinois General Assembly for entrusting me and the JEO team with the implementation of this important program. Because I don't have to tell anyone in this room that real justice means community and economic development. So, education, health care, housing, economic development, just policies in these areas will not only keep people from cycling in and out of the system, they can help keep people out of the system in the first place. And as I always say, yes, we need to focus on successful reentry, but we need to be just as laser focused on successful no entry. Where communities are healthy, families' needs are being met, and instead of a pipeline to incarceration, we have an ever-widening pipeline to opportunity. I am proud that we have embarked on this historic journey, a journey that goes beyond reforming a system to transforming individuals and families and entire communities all across our great state. But a journey like this requires vision, and it requires determination, and it requires courageous leadership, which is why I'm so very excited to invite to the lectern someone who exhibits all of these qualities and someone that I'm so proud to call friend. Someone who, by the way, I happen to believe is the very best governor in the United States of America. Please welcome Governor Jb Pritzker.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And before I begin, I should just say, everybody, please give another enormous round of applause for our amazing Lieutenant Governor, Juliana Stratton. I want you to know what a terrific partner Juliana has been. She has demonstrated real empathy in public service. She's brought her lifetime of commitment to justice to everything that we do. And it's been a real honor to work with her, not just in Springfield, but all across the state, to learn with her, to lead with her, as we work hard to put Springfield back on the side of families across our state. As Juliana mentioned, we're closing in on the one-year mark since our inauguration. And it has been a terrific year for Illinois. One of the amazing things about this state is the tremendous... Sorry, ma'am. Can we make sure and talk afterward? I appreciate you. Appreciate you. Thank you. Thank you. It's been a terrific year for the state of Illinois, one of tremendous progress, one in which we overcame the bitterness and the dysfunction of the past. Hopefully some of you have even forgotten it, but I know you really haven't. That we're shaping an Illinois that serves as a beacon of justice for the nation, proving that we're stronger when all of our residents have real opportunities to improve their lives. We're attempting, finally, to build an Illinois that works for everyone, and a criminal justice system that is fair and that is reformed, which is a key element of what we're talking about. We're taking a holistic approach to reform. Of course, the stories that the Lieutenant Governor shared about the burden of bail and about truth in sentencing laws are just two examples of the many, many costs of the system that we have today. Costs to the taxpayers, but more importantly, costs to people's lives. We need real change. An essential tenet of good governance is recognizing the need to change the laws that have failed. In Illinois today, we spend $1.4 billion to hold 40,000 individuals in an overcrowded prison system that has proven itself too expensive, too punitive, and too ineffective at fulfilling its purpose, keeping Illinois families safe. So already my administration has taken action to shape a more just criminal justice system. We've funded training programs so that prisoners can gain skills to get a job when they return home. We've added incentives for additional educational and wellness programming through sentencing credits. We've established a law giving young adults facing long prison sentences the opportunity to seek parole. And we've banned private correctional centers and private immigration detention centers that earn their profits off of Donald Trump's unconscionable immigration policies. And you shouldn't lose your voting rights when you've been accused but not convicted of a crime. So we're making sure that the 20,000 people who are detained pre-trial each year don't miss out on the opportunity to have their voices heard. That means putting physical polling places in the Cook County Jail for detainees. If they're eligible to vote, they ought to be able to vote. And they're not convicted, they're simply arrested. We need to give them their rights. And we've authorized a vote-by-mail program in all of the other counties across the state. We're offering first-time voter registration forms to interested eligible voters that are in custody, as well as nonpartisan educational sessions on the voting process, on current events, and on government institutions for those near the end of their incarceration. And of course, in June of 2019, I signed into law one of the most substantial criminal justice reforms in the entire nation. What was that? It was the legalization of cannabis, with the first ever focus on providing benefits to the communities that have been so ill affected by the war on drugs. And just in the last 2 weeks, we've marked 3 major milestones in our adult use cannabis rollout. First, the Restore, Reinvest, and Renew Fund, the R3 fund, is already benefiting from our allocation of the 25% of the tax revenues, money that will go directly back into the communities most harmed by our unjust drug laws. Second, 600 of the 700 applications for new recreational cannabis licenses are social equity applicants. And we're going to create new successful entrepreneurs from Black and brown communities and from communities across the state that have been left out and left behind. And third, and I'm very proud of this, I'm proud to announce that 9 days ago I began the process of restoring dignity and opportunity by pardoning the first 11,000 people who've had to live with the stigma of a criminal record with a low-level cannabis conviction. And that's just the first group of pardons among what will be thousands and thousands of families who now will have restored to them access to jobs, access to housing, to professional licensing, to financial aid to go to school, to human services. So think about it. Thousands and thousands of families with new opportunities to secure the lives that they want for themselves and for their children, finally. Countless communities with greater access to tools that they can use to build their neighborhoods. That's real reform. Our approach is unique in the United States, but desperately needed in all 50 states. We're now a leader in the nation, and it is my hope that other states will look to Illinois as a lesson in justice. That said, we can't rest on our laurels. There is much more work that needs to be done. That's why today, Lieutenant Governor Stratton and I are proud to outline 3 areas of criminal justice reform that our administration will focus on in the coming few years. First, we're going to work to end the cash bail system in Illinois. It disproportionately forces low-income people of color into a destructive cycle of unearned detention and instability. Second, we're going to reform low-level drug crimes and divert them into substance abuse treatment programs. It's the right thing to do, and it will save taxpayers money by decreasing the number of people we send to prison in the first place. Last fiscal year alone, nearly 3,000 people entered prison for substance possessions of under 15 grams. For so many individuals, these are activities far better treated with rehabilitation than time behind bars. And it's time that we altered our existing system to reflect a 21st century understanding of mental health and substance addiction. And third, we're going to reduce excessive lengths of stay in prison by reforming mandatory sentencing, giving good time credit for time served, and increasing opportunities for supervised release. We need to reduce our prison population. None of this work will be easy. Already so many advocates and activists, including so many of you here today, have dedicated years, if not decades, to pushing for change in a nation that locks people up at the highest rate in the entire world. But we're here today, as Juliana said, to join you in dedicating our administration to writing a new narrative for Illinois. Many of you here today have paved the way for the work that we hope to bring across the finish line, and we thank you for that. So let me say thank you for your persistence over so many years, for your passion to make a difference in people's lives, and for your service to communities all across our state. As President Obama said, change will not come if we wait for some other person or some other time. We are the ones we've been waiting for. We are the change that we seek. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce a change agent to you. I want to invite Michelle Morales to join us here on stage to continue this conversation. Thank you.
It's for the governor. So what made you decide to take on criminal justice work and make it central to your campaign, central to your administration, central to the policies that you're passing, and why did you sign the executive order for the Justice, Equity, and Opportunity Initiative?
Well, let me begin by saying that I think when anybody chooses to think about running for public office, and I'm looking at some of the elected officials here, that you start with your values. What it is that you believe in your life, how you carry out your life, how you treat other people, how your parents taught you to act in the world. Those are all things that drive you just in your everyday life, hopefully. And for me, that's what drove me ultimately to choose to run for public office. Those same values, the values about standing up for those who are oppressed, the values of believing in working toward a more just society every day, social justice, criminal justice reform, thinking about how to make people's lives better, those same values that my parents taught me to believe in and that my religion teaches me are the same values that I brought to the subject of criminal justice reform, of the work of the JEO. Now, let me be clear, though. The JEO, in its construct as it is today, really is a product of the creativity, the desire to get something done, the imagination of our Lieutenant Governor. She is the one who stepped forward to say, look, if we're going to organize our efforts behind really making a difference in the criminal justice system and for people that we want to help lift up their families and their lives and to change communities, this needs to be infused in every aspect of our administration. And you can only do that if you've got an initiative that touches every aspect of our administration. So that is what she put together. That is what we believe. It's what we're trying to spread across the state's government administration. I know that sounds, you think that a governor ought to be able to just order it to happen. But that isn't the way it works. You've really got to infuse it in the leadership and across mid-level management and all the way down to frontline workers across what are 60,000 people that work in state government. And that's the work that JEO has undertaken, and I'm really proud to have carried those values forward to working with Juliana on JEO, and I'm so proud of the work that she's already gotten done.
Well, thank you, Governor. One of the things I just want to say, though, that from the moment that I met him, these are the values that he expressed. And so it wasn't something that sort of developed over time. One of the things that made us click from the very beginning was the fact that we both had these values about really fighting for justice for all communities and lifting up communities that particularly have been left behind. And so, so now we see this. So now, ma'am. All right, thank you, ma'am. As we indicated, we will be happy to speak with you, and we'll take some time to talk with you right after this. Let me say this, every voice is important, and we want to hear yours. Allow us to have this conversation, and I promise we will have some time to talk afterwards. Would that work? Thank you. So one of the things that's really important is to think about the leadership even in state government. So to talk about taking these kinds of steps and focusing on justice, equity, and opportunity across the board in state agencies requires assembling a team. And one of the things I'm so proud of is the assembling a team. The governor made it very clear to have the most diverse administration in the history of the state of Illinois. And that brings a different perspective so that we can ensure when we talk about justice and equity and opportunity that these voices are all at the table. So it's something that's been ingrained in this new administration to work together around these issues.
Hopefully, okay. We're just going to pass back and forth. It's been a tremendous year. I think we can all agree, right? Particularly coming after 4 years where we saw communities and social services decimated. A lot of incredible legislation that's being signed in and being passed. So what are you most proud of in the last year? And this is actually a question for the both of you.
You want me to start? Okay, so I think there's so many things to be proud of. Of course, we've come off of a historic legislative session this past term, and of course, much more work to do, which is why we're here today. But I think for me at least, there's a couple of things. One, I'm really, really proud of how much we have engaged stakeholders at the community level. This has been really important. I'm a restorative justice practitioner and advocate. I believe in the words, the wisdom is in the room. You all have heard me say that, and that means that people who are in communities, know their communities, love their communities, they know best as we think about policy development. And so the fact that we have engaged over 500 stakeholders in this first year, just in terms of conversation, but have touched thousands to really make sure that the voices of community are lifted up, that's something to be proud of. The governor and I both believe that to get things done, it's not something that's done just from an office. It has to be getting into community and making sure we lift up community voice. The governor mentioned the voting rights bill, and it was a bill that I did not see over the finish line. I was the original chief sponsor of that bill, the jail voting rights bill, when I was a member of the Illinois House of Representatives, and then passed it along to Senator Omar Aquino, who was my Senate counterpart when I ran the bill, and Representative Chris Welch, who got it over the finish line, but the governor signed it into law. The previous governor had issued an amendatory veto, but that bill came from the fact that I was knocking on doors campaigning for state representative, and I had far too many people tell me I can't get involved, sorry, because I have a felony on my record. So there was a lot of misinformation, and I want to make sure it's clear to everyone here, having a felony on your record does not keep you from voting here in the state of Illinois. Some states that's the case, but not here in Illinois. But too many people didn't know it, so they were still disenfranchised. And then, as the governor stated, we also wanted to expand voting rights right in jail. So people, groups like Chicago Votes and others who really took the Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, I'm not gonna start because I hear the woohoo, and I'm like, I'm gonna miss some of these groups. But the goal was to make sure that people had access to the ballot because people were disenfranchised because they were lingering in our jails. And then I think I'll just mention the juvenile parole, youthful parole offender bill, which the governor signed into law, and that was so critical because, you know, about 40 years ago, we got rid of parole here in Illinois. And so this was an important step to make sure that those who had been committed an offense prior to the age of 21 to be able to be eligible for that consideration. And that was an important first step, and it continues to open up this conversation around where we need to go. So there's been some tremendous accomplishments over this first year.
I'll just chime in a little bit on the end of this because those are so many things that I too am proud of. But I guess one of the things I'm proudest of is, I mean, think about what's going on in Washington, D.C. Think about what was going on in the state of Illinois a year ago plus. The rancor, the division, the dysfunction, the failure to get anything done, the unwillingness to listen to people that you disagree with. All of those things were going on. I'm maybe proudest of, and certainly among the things I'm proudest of, is that we've overcome that we're talking to one another, whether you're on the same side of the aisle or on the opposite side of the aisle. We're listening to one another. And that, to me, is why we made so much progress over the last year.
Lieutenant Governor, when I think of you, I think of justice reform. As the Chancellor mentioned in your introduction, you have been in this space for a long time. Quick secret, we both interviewed for a job at MCFA Challenge. I'm very lucky that she turned it down and I got it. And look at where she's at today.
I love MCFA Challenge, by the way.
Or maybe I would have been the Lieutenant Governor, but maybe not. But you spoke a little bit about your family's story. Why has justice reform been such a central issue in your life? Why have you been such a fierce advocate for it? If you can share some of that with us today.
Well, I mean, much of it is from kind of dovetails off of what the governor just spoke about. I'm a lawyer. And in law school, you are not necessarily trained to work together. You're trained to fight and win your case. And oftentimes, when I look at the justice system, I saw the punitive nature of it. I was trained as a mediator while I was in law school with the Center for Conflict Resolution, and understood some of the dynamics of conflict and what leads people to this place where it has to be us versus them, which also promotes kind of that punitive nature. But because I was a mediator, I really understood the idea of how do you bring voices to the table so that you can try to resolve a problem, not just kind of go to the quick one wins, one loses, but how do we come together and really figure out a way that we can come together and reach a resolution. And so very early on, I was introduced to restorative justice. You all know restorative justice is not a new concept. It's based on indigenous people who understood that when you solve problems, you don't go outside of your community. The solutions that we need are found right in our community. And so I started working with a project called Community Panels for Youth, and with Cheryl Graves and Ora Shub, two mentors of mine, mothers of the restorative justice movement. God rest, may Ora's soul rest in peace. And we're looking at this concept of young people who are in the justice system who are being locked up when really what they needed to be is connected to people in their community who would help give them some idea on how to be on the right path. So people who said, instead of locking them up, you broke the window in my business, instead of that being something that should go on your record and change the course of your life, how about you come and help fix the window? And if you can't fix the window, how about you work at my store after school and I build a relationship with you, and then now you can pay for the window to be rebuilt and no record is left for them. That's restorative justice. And so for me, the reason why it's so important when I talk about my family building community, this is all about the power of community, the power of what happens when we are connected one to another, when we care for one another, when we have a heart for one another, and say it's not enough to just put you into a system, it's rather how do we as community that has so much wisdom, including people, by the way, who are in the system, to add their voices to how we can do this better.
Governor Pritzker, there's a perception and kind of a reality, right, that downstate and Chicago are different. And, you know, when you leave the state of Illinois, people often even talk about it, that it's like almost two very different worlds within one state, two areas with different issues, with different concerns, with different realities. What would you say to people who would say that justice reform is just a Chicago issue or just an issue for certain communities?
I would start by saying there is injustice everywhere in the state of Illinois, and we've got to correct it wherever it exists. And we have minority communities all across the state, black and brown communities, not to mention the injustices that are occurring against people who are simply living in poverty. That we have to lift everybody up that lives in poverty. And that's the beginning of real justice, frankly. And that's why you see that although we talked a lot today about criminal justice reform, and that has a box around it with a set of issues that people normally identify, actually underlying all of it is lifting up people's economic situation, lifting up communities across the state. And just to remind you that, you know, we talk a lot about the level of violence in the city of Chicago, but we have communities across the state that have a higher incidence on a per capita basis of violence than the city. And so, you know, add to that the situation, the trauma that the children are living in those communities across the state. So there's work to do everywhere. It isn't limited to an urban environment either. So that's what I would say. And you have to travel the state to see it and understand it. And I've done quite a lot of that. You know, listening to people who live in communities that are different than the ones that I grew up in and the ones that you grew up in, listening to those people and then acting upon the needs of those communities will lead you to making real reform and correcting injustices that exist that you may not have otherwise known about unless you were actually there listening.
Yeah, I want to just pick up on what you said about like lifting up communities. There's some things that sometimes don't always come up when we talk about criminal justice reform. As the governor said, you know, you have this box, but things like raising the minimum wage for Illinoisans all across the state and giving 1.4 million Illinoisans a raise. That is something that is an effort to help lift up communities all across our state. And this governor signed that into law.
And making childcare more affordable,
Exactly.
and making college more affordable. These are all things that we have done and are working on continuously, because this is about justice too.
That's exactly right.
Lieutenant Governor, you already made comments around ensuring how communities are centered in the work, right? And that's one of the things at Woods Fund that we're constantly supporting through our grantee partners is making sure, right, that the voice of community, the lived experience is included when public policy is written, right? We know there is a long history, and even if we know who writes public policy, that often people who look like you and I are often either not at the table, not the writers of those policies, et cetera, and then that leads to issues during implementation. If you can talk a little further around how you're ensuring that that voice is embedded in the public policy and the legislation that you all are signing and putting into effect. And you know me, 20 years of youth work, how are youth a part of it? We know that youth tend to get the very worst sometimes of the policy that comes into play. And so how are both of those kind of embedded in the work that you all are doing?
So I'll start by just a brief story that some of you may have heard me tell before, but because it's reflective of why the voice is so important. A few years ago, I was part of a team doing an assessment of Logan Women's Correctional Center. And we spent a week there talking with women, talking with staff, doing focus groups and observations. And when we came back to report out, there was a woman in the audience who said these words. She stood up, and I went and asked her, is it okay if I share what you've just said? So she's given me the okay. Her name is Maria. And Maria said this. She said, I was in prison, and then I went to prison. And then I returned back to prison. And that struck me so much because it was this woman saying, I know you all are standing there as policymakers and I know you're doing this work, but let me tell you my story and what it's been like to live in a community where there have been so many challenges that when I went to the actual prison facility, it was not as distinct as it needed to be. And I returned back to conditions that often can lead people to cycle in and out of the system. So the idea of, at that moment, and I said to her, I said, we're gonna work on this. And I said, because you raised your voice and talked about it in that way, and there was a group, some of whom are in this room today, and we worked on and passed and got signed into law the Women's Correctional Services Act, which is the first in the country to make sure that women in Illinois correctional facilities get gender responsive and trauma reformed programming and services. So what that means is that we have to include the voice of young people. We have to include the voice of people who are currently or previously incarcerated. But I also think about all across the system, because a lot of people don't know that the work that I did on the preschool expulsion bill, which was to end preschoolers ages 3 and 4 getting expelled, was lockstep and in concert with members of law enforcement and Fight Crime, Invest in Kids, who were very adamant that we needed to work on how do we make sure that young children are not getting expelled from school. So when we talk about voices at the table, we have to look to people to say, we may not have always seen us being on the same page, but good ideas, as the governor always says, come from everywhere. And so we want to make sure that we address these issues on a bipartisan basis, but then we also include those that are currently touching the system, as well as young people who have been such incredible voices for change, not just in the state of Illinois, but across the country. We know that it is young people lifting up their voices that is often what gets us to move. And by the way, the work that we all do here in this room, we recognize that we didn't get here when we think about justice reform. This did not happen overnight. We're talking about decades and decades of disinvestment and a war on drugs, and we see decades of efforts to lead us to this point. What we do now is for future generations. We're trying to plant seeds and put us on the path so that future generations have a better path. And so we must listen to the young people. We've been talking to young people. I've been to IYC, Harrisburg, and other places. I've been to communities where I've sat down and circled with young people. So we're going to continue to include their voices at the table because we know that the work that we're doing is really to make a better future for all of them.
And let me just add one more thing to this, and that's that, you know, we talk a lot about listening to people all across the state. Remember that sitting in the front row here are a number of elected officials who have been leaders on criminal justice reform. The bill to ban private detention centers was sponsored by Senator Peters, sitting right here in the front row. All across, I could call out each one of them. I mean, we've got, Representative Welch and Representative Slaughter and Representative Stava Murray here, and one of the great criminal justice advocates in Cook County, Kim Fox here. And to be clear, I want to, I walked into the office of Governor, Juliana walked in, she had been a state representative before you had sent her already to do this work. But we walked into these offices, and the work, as Juliana said, a lot of it had been done. A lot of it had been proposed, and the people that you've sent to represent you on these issues have been leaders on it. And I just want to say, you asked the question, how does it get embedded, in the way you think about public policy? The answer is because you sent good people to represent you who fight for it.
So this is going to be the last question before we get, hopefully soon, cards from the audience. Okay. And so you had a long campaign. You're a little over, I think, a year now in governing. What have you both learned from each other, from the campaign experience, from you've been in government, but your first year governing together and at this level, sort of what have all been the learnings that you've both had?
I'm gonna let you go.
Okay. Well, there's been a lot that we've learned. And I think that, first of all, we very much like working with each other. And I really do mean it when I say that, Governor Pritzker is somebody that I'm always proud to say that I stand with and work with and partner with, because he brings his heart to this work as well. But I think that when you campaign and say you have these big ideas and things that you want to see happen, and you recognize that you have a term of 4 years, that's the term that you get, you want to see things happen. You want to get in there and you just want them to happen really quickly, and government doesn't work like that. In case did anybody know that here? Government doesn't work like that. So it often takes a lot more to be able to get the things done that you want to see, and you recognize that you have to keep chipping away and getting the wins and moving forward and being very methodical and being very persistent. And that's something that we certainly have learned. And I think that, one of the things that the governor does so well and has always talked about doing is, and it was alluded to earlier, is bringing people together and recognizing that to get these big things done, it takes all of us. It takes hands on deck. It takes working with policymakers and advocates and organizers. It takes working on a bipartisan basis. It takes making sure that we don't kind of say, well, because it's hard, let's think smaller, but saying, nope, we're thinking big, and it is going to be difficult, but if we all come together, we can get it done. So those are kind of the, it's a very different role than being a legislator, where I could just say, well, I want to see this happen, I'm going to file a bill, I'm going to work the bill, I'm going to make it happen and get people to support it, and it's passed and done. This is about thinking very broadly about the 13 million people that we represent all across the state of Illinois, and making sure that we are making decisions for the best, in the best interest of everyone.
Yeah, I'll just add quickly that this is the greatest partner you can have in the governor's office. Working together, I bounce ideas off of Juliana and me, and I think we share not only a common respect for one another, but I have enormous admiration for her, and it is one of the great privileges of my life in public service to be able to sit next to, work with, bounce ideas off of, and get things done with her. And that's been not surprising, because I picked her to be my partner. So not surprising exactly, but just something that I wanted to acknowledge to all of you. And the other thing to say is that, and this may be a little bit was a surprise to me, you all have set us up for success. You've laid a path. Now, you may not have gotten all the way to where you wanted to be, That's our job, right? We got here so that we could push to the finish line. And you're helping us do that, and we need you to continue to do that, because it doesn't all fall on us. We can't just decide this is what's going to happen. We need to bring along legislators, not the ones in this room, the ones that don't agree with us that aren't in this room. We have to bring them along. You help do that. There's a lot of persuasion involved, there's a lot of listening involved, but you help do that, activists, advocates, and I just want to say, as a result of my experience, thank you so much for the work that you've done and the work that we will do together over the next 3 years.
Thanks for watching, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our channel. And while you're at it, please leave us a comment. Thank you for watching.